Well, hello, everybody from the City Biz audience. This is a particular pleasure for me. I think this is my roughly 12th interview with City Biz. And today I'm interviewing Carolyn Lukensmeyer, who is one of the inspirations for me getting involved in the democracy reform bridging movement, I believe 14 years ago. So this is a rare pleasure. Carolyn has a PhD in organizational behavior from Case Western. And in I believe it was 95, she founded an organization called America Speaks, which is one of the leaders in deliberative democracy and democracy renewal. So that was quite a few years ago. And then she had a long stint with the National Institute of Civil Discourse, where I first met Carolyn. And she has recently retired, from NICD, but she hasn't retired from her passion to improve and create the healthy self-governance that we all desire. So welcome, Carolyn. Thank you so much for participating.
David, thank you for having me. I'm delighted to do this with you.
Well, thank you. And, I threw out a term. I was going to get immediately into discussing America Speaks or NICD, but deliberative democracy, what does that mean? That might be a good way for our City Biz audience to focus on the work you do and how you view democracy in America.
Well, David, the term deliberative democracy actually first showed up in the academy in the 1980s. And it was when people began to say, hey, the world's really changed since our founding documents were presented to the world. And if we're going to achieve the goal of self-governance that's so beautifully written about there, we got to figure out some way to have the public actually deliberate with each other on these big policy issues and therefore influence the public policies that so much impact every one of our lives. So the whole idea was we, the people, could come together and we could thoughtfully deliberate, discuss, argue about what's best for us from the perspective of the common good.
And when you founded America Speaks in 1995, how did you attempt to effectuate that deliberative dialogue concept?
Well, David, I think your listeners would be interested to know that I came to the point of choosing to create America Speaks as I had the honor of serving as the first woman chief of staff in the state of Ohio under Governor Dick Celeste. And in that experience, I really saw that fundamentally after the voting and other than public opinion polls, Americans were really not brought together to have serious discussions of policy issues. When I completed that privileged experience, I came to Washington, D.C. and worked in the Clinton-Gore administration. And I have to say, in Ohio, I found myself concerned about the role of money, the role of special interests. But when I got to Washington, I understood that Ohio was child's play compared to how the system operated in Washington. So I worked for the Clinton-Gore administration. I had an office in the West Wing until about March of 95. And then I left to say, wait a minute. We now live in a culture which, given the support of technology, we could bring together hundreds, thousands of Americans to really talk about these tough issues. Back then, one of the hottest issues was Social Security reform. And here we are again, how many decades later? So I created America Speaks by putting together the New England Town Meeting, which frankly, as you know, David, still today, towns in New England decide their school budgets, they decide their town budgets by getting together, talking it through, and making a decision. But I added to that the use of computer technology and voting keypads, which now we can do on our cell phones. But in the 95 to 2015, we were doing them with independent little keypads. And we brought together thousands of people who were demographically representative of the jurisdiction we were working with. In 98, 99, it was the country with Social Security. From 98, for 8 years, it was the city of Washington about budgets. But we fundamentally said, if in the room is a demographically representative sample of the public, and they have a conversation about fact-based material, our belief is that they will come to a decision that is in the interest of the common good. And we saw that repeated time and time again. We did over 200 projects in America Speaks. And in every case, what I just said happened. Most dramatic probably was after 9/11 in New York City. We had 5,000 people, demographically representative of all the boroughs, plus a couple of counties in Connecticut where people came into the city to work every day, sat in the room, looked at the first conceptual plans put out by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, and frankly, roundly rejected the entire set of premises on which those plans were created. And to the mayor's credit, to the governor's credit, to the development corporation's credit, they threw out those plans and started over again, David.
Interesting. And you work with American Speaks. Did that directly lead you to becoming executive director of the National Institute of Civil Discourse? How did that transition occur, and how are those two organizations related or piggybacked upon each other? How'd that process work for you?
Well, it's a great question, and I have to give a bit of context. America Speaks was extremely successful at our work, partly because I understood how the government worked and who had to be in the room to make the decision. But the Great Recession of 2008, 2009 killed the business model of America Speaks. So I knew it was a time that I should be thinking about a different way to make a positive impact on our democracy. And you and everyone else listening will remember Gabby Giffords was almost killed, was shot in the Tucson mass shooting in which 6 people died and 13 were injured. And President Obama, when he came to the University of Arizona to deal with that event, he put out a challenge. And he said, what is this university, what is this community going to do to honor the legacy of Representative Giffords and the people who actually died? The university acted with lightning speed. Anybody who's ever been associated with a university will be shocked. In the next 2 weeks, they came together and created the National Institute for Civil Discourse, and I became its founding director. So at that point, my work focused more on what was happening in Congress, how to get the national media to pay attention to these issues. And it wasn't too many years before the Trumpism phenomena led to the extraordinary polarization that we now live in. And that's about the time you and I met and began to talk about how could this be bridged.
Yeah. Well, I have very fond memories of what for me was a very powerful program within the National Institute of Civil Discourse, and that was the Next Generation program, I believe led by the son, Ted Celeste, is that correct, of the previous?
It was his brother.
His brother.
His younger brother.
Younger brother, yes. And I had the pleasure of attending an event in Columbus, Ohio, where state representatives who would, from the left and from the right, who would never sit in a room together, came together. And could you tell me a little about what the principle was of Next Generation and how that fits into the work you do?
Well, Ted Celeste was at that point, or had been, a member of the Ohio legislature, a Democrat, and he partnered with a gentleman from Iowa who was a Republican. And they began to think about, we know what's happening is wrong in terms of our legislatures not being able to work across the aisle. What can we do? So they designed an experiential workshop where the legislators from the two parties came together over usually 2 days, frankly, and really began to once again meet each other's people, to talk about what their common values were, and then fashion a set of actions about how could we have this legislature become more cross-partisan again, really work together across the aisle. It was a very successful program. NICD is still doing that program, although because of the COVID era, they're now doing mostly this online rather than we did in person. As when Ted was leading the program, we worked in 19 states, more than 1,000 legislators, 1,000 legislators, and in every case, in the year following that work, or years following, there was more bipartisan legislation introduced and bills passed. It was one of NICD's most successful programs.
Well, that leads me to another thought, because you've been involved in NGOs for many years, and you know the plight they all are in of money, fundraising. And a lot of the great organizations doing great work are seeking funding from the same people. So we have a audience of a city biz audience here of a lot of business people. Why is the work you're doing, the democracy work you're doing, important for business? And for those who really don't know anything about the field, how do they step in? How do they get involved?
Well, it's a great question. One of the things the ways in which we got off track in our country, I think, is we began to think that our democracy that only needed to pay attention between the government and the people, rather than understanding that for democracy to be healthy, virtually every sector has a piece of the responsibility and needs to be accountable for how our democracy works. So it is real that business is re-engaged in the last decade, has been much more interested, but often does have the question, well, how do I know I'm going to get a return on my investment? How do I know where to put these funds? Well, David, I don't know if this was your intention, but it leads directly to what I'm basically doing now, which I'm co-leading a project with Matt Leiniger through the National Civic League to create a map and to create real visualizations of all the healthy democracy work happening in this country at this time. Part of our goal is we know that it will surprise people. There's a lot more positive going on than people know about. And it covers 12 categories of work. Bridging is probably one of the largest. National service is another very large one. But there's organizations that are just working to protect our institutions, given what happened in 2020. There's organizations working on different styles of voting that would allow more representation, like ranked choice voting, like top 5 voting. So whether it's structural or relational or culture, we're somewhere in the 8,000 to 10,000 organizations doing this work. But your fundamental question to me was, how would someone in business know where they should invest their funds?
Exactly.
My view is the following. The people who make those decisions in the business organizations should look at these categories. Which one of these do we care the most about? Or which one of these do we think is in the most danger in our country right now? In my experience in a fair number of business organizations, gerrymandering, or where the politicians are picking their voters instead of the voters picking their politicians, is a very high priority. So on our map, you would be able to identify whether it's a national organization or a state-based organization that's right now working on shifting redistricting to take it out of state legislatures and put it in the hands of citizen commissions. The most recent successful example of that was in the state of Michigan, where some young people, frankly, just pretty fresh out of college, said that's partly what's wrong in Michigan. The legislature each year pulls off more and more districts to keep them safe for the incumbent. So let's shift it. Let's make it citizen-based. And they were successful in 2019 to do that.
Well, that's fascinating. So that would be very helpful for business for people or regular citizens who just want to be involved and help. Just the knowledge. But part of it, problem I run into, I do a lot of speaking around the country, and people say to me, I love the work you're doing. It's certainly important, but nothing can ever change. David, you're wasting your time. So how do you deal with that pessimism that, the system is so much money in the system and we're just regular people. Nothing's ever going to change, Carolyn. How do you change that mindset?
Well, David, I'm not surprised that you hear that, and I'm sure you're not surprised that I hear it all the time too. And I hear it coming from mainly two perspectives. When it's individual citizens or residents, it's because the system feels too big. It feels too complex. What could I as an individual do? Very often in organizations, the dilemma becomes, wait a minute, I'm an insurance company. And if I follow this reform, I'm going to be seen by the other party as favoring that other party. And from my business interests, I have to be cross-partisan. I have to be neutral from a political point of view. What I find helps right now in the circumstances we're in, post-2020, when we really saw an actual insurrection in our nation's capital, is people are understanding that our democracy, the institutions, and our culture of being able to come together are both deep at threat. And what I find is helpful for people is it doesn't matter that you're an individual. It doesn't matter that you're one organization. Every single one of us is in several circles of influence. My family, my friends, my colleagues at work. And if you choose a path to support what you believe for the future we need in our democracy, working just in those circles that you influence, what happens is there soon is a crossover between one of your circles and one of David Nevin's circles and one of Carolyn Lukensmeyer's circles. And then people begin to be surprised pretty quickly. Wow, there are more of us who care about this and believe we could do something positive than I ever imagined.
That's always fascinating, and I had a sense this would happen. Your answers always lead me to other thoughts and other questions. And you mentioned the current threats to democracy in the sense that something's wrong. And you and I have been doing this, as we said, for many, many years. And I think well, I'll speak for myself. I was always focused on the long term. We're not going to solve these problems overnight. But has anything shifted for you? It has for me a bit in terms of, yes, still focus on the long term, but is there anything particularly as a nation we should be focused on between now and, in your mind, between now and the election or in the next 12 months? Or are you still primarily focused on the long-term solutions to our systemic problems?
I appreciate the question very much, David. And for a few years now, certainly since 2020, to kind of lock this in for me, I actually think those of us who are deeply committed to this work need to simultaneously be working on a short-term goal and continue to invest in the long-term systemic possibilities of change. What I'm about to say, it's very hard to say with people not believing that I'm coming from a partisan perspective, but all I can say to people who are watching this and listening to it, I'm not. Given what we saw happen in 2020, the only thing that can be a real protection to our democracy at this particular time is an increase in voter turnout. We had the largest turnout we ever had in 2020. We had an even larger turnout in 2022, and that's what we have to have in 2024. Because any of these structural work that any of us are doing isn't going to happen fast enough to make any difference in this next election and probably the couple of elections after that. So if we really believe in the foundational documents of our country, that every single person has a right, the opportunity, and the access to vote, the only thing that gives us what is a true picture of the majority of the country's will at this particular time is voting. So my view is, whatever persuasion you have, however you look at where we are, the most important thing you can do short term is ensure as many people as possible are registered and actually go through the process of voting. And I'm sincere. I'm not saying who they should vote for. I'm saying they need to vote so that we can discover an actual majority of the will of the people of the state of our democracy currently.
Well, amen. I agree with that. Unfortunately, some believe that the request to just asking people to vote and not saying what they should vote for is partisan, but that's the foundation of our democracy, and especially young people. We need more young people to vote. That's for sure. We're running out of time, but I have a couple more questions. Um, in terms of your life history, before you got involved in this, when you were studying behavioral psychology or behavioral organization, were you always a deeply political person, or was that a process that developed over time, and then are they related? How did this come to pass as becoming a major passion of your life?
Well, it's a great question, and one I've actually thought quite a bit about. First, I would say is I'm not a very political person. I learned how the political system works out of a desire to influence it. I grew up in a small town in north central Iowa in a very large multi-generational family, David. And I don't know how listeners, some of you will understand it right away and some of you won't. We all grow up with a role in our family. And even as a very young child, I mean very young, 5 or 6, one of the roles that I had in our family was the mediator. So by the time I got to college and by the time I was looking at postgraduate work and graduate work, I already had a whole young life experience of what are the options for how to get people to come to the table to actually hear each other and do something that's better for everybody. So I simultaneously, in my education, was interested in the psychology of it, as well as the issue of change of systems. So my PhD was literally how do you change systems? But simultaneously, I did a lot of deep work in psychology, sociology, and anthropology. Well, how do these human beings behave anyway? So actually, those two things came together across the course of my career.
Well, that's particularly fascinating. Well, we're running out of time, but all the work you've done all these years, if your dreams come true and we have a more deliberative, collaborative democracy, how would that change everyday American lives? What difference would it be make if in 10 years from now we had made significant progress? How's that going to affect the average middle class person, the average business person, the average family person?
That's a great question, and actually one I've been thinking quite a lot about lately. What I realized for years I've described myself as a very optimistic person, that's part of how I've been able to stay in this work with such passion for so long. And recently I've begun to realize that I need to shift part of the passion and energy I feel about this to more time imagining the future that would be necessary for us to actually reach the aspiration of our founding documents. So that in fact, if that happened, there'd be less of a wealth gap and an income gap. If that happened, there really would be equal opportunity for education. If that happened, we'd be putting our collective focus into what are all the positive things we need to do. If we take climate change for a minute, to reforest half the earth, as E.O. Wilson would say, where we begin to focus on here's the target that's necessary to solve climate change, to solve homelessness, and that's where our energy would go, rather than focusing on fighting the entrenched interests that currently keep the structural systems from allowing any of those self-governing outcomes to emerge.
Well, that's a perfect ending. And I can tell the City Biz audience that you have a rare combination of not only imagining the future, there's no shortage of good ideas, but imagining the future without a concrete plan, without expertise, uh, it's never going to be achieved. So thank you so much, Carolyn, for the opportunity to share your vision for the future and the present to our audience. Thank you so much.
David, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.